So good morning, everybody. My name is Brian Freedman. This is Rob Saland here. We're here to talk to you guys about Active Directory authentication today. A thrilling topic, but this is actually the perfect audience for that type of thing. Brian,
Yeah,
Rob.
I honestly didn't think there would be that many of you, since this topic we know is so absolutely riveting. So, thank you for showing up.
If you guys want to ask questions or call on us, we affectionately go by ManBun1, ManBun2. So Brian, Rob,
or the dueling man buns.
The dueling man buns is our stage name.
It's a good one too.
So yeah, I think really kind of upfront our agenda is to kind of go through these items here. But I also kind of want to acknowledge here this isn't meant to be a Microsoft or Active Directory or really kind of any vendor bashing session. I want to expose and talk about problems a lot of organizations are facing, kind of inherent risks that are built into kind of how solutions are built today. Then also what are things that we can do as technology professionals to improve posture overall. Anything else, Rob?
No, I think you nailed it.
Okay.
All right. So let's jump into the problem here. So as far as the problem, what we wanted to do first was kind of contextualize the foundational aspects of identity and how they're related to some of the larger business risks driving some of these kind of catastrophic attacks that we're all seeing in the news and all these terrible things, right? So if you look on the bottom here, right, these are some common trends that we see businesses adopting, right, or just market conditions in general that are kind of facilitating some of these core types of attacks, right? These core types of kind of catastrophic events. And so we kind of look at this in three levels, right? So you have the business risk drivers, you have the actual events themselves, but when you tie everything together, kind of the common core across all these things is abusive privileges and abusive authentication authorization, which you all know, otherwise you wouldn't be here. But I think if, looking at the bottom, one of the things that really stands out, I mean, yes, everybody's moving to the cloud. We know that service trumps everything, right? If it's not enabling revenue or generating revenue somehow, then it's going to be focused on the more operational component of things. But I think the compliance vacuum is a really interesting one because, yes, it is absolutely important to reference some kind of compliance framework in building out a security program, right? It's a good way to reference something, to know how you're making progress against certain control sets. And of course, you need a standard of due care, cyber liability insurance, all those types of things. But what I think is what we're seeing, what's kind of turning around too, is businesses just saying, look, I want somebody to go through this checklist and that's all we want, right? That's kind of the bare minimum of what we want. That's all we want to spend money on. We don't want to do anything beyond that. And then unfortunately, right, and I'm sure everybody in this room knows this, it takes some kind of event for that thought process to change, right? And all these things that, again, when you go kind of down that compliance checklist, they're all focused on the perimeter and they're all focused on, I mean, there's some internal monitoring, right, things like that. But for the most part, these are kind of the base level things that every business should be doing. So, we believe you have to go beyond that if you want to really protect your most critical assets in the business.
So one thing I want to add to this slide too also is I think as identity administrators overall, there's been at least one point in our career where we had to do something we didn't want to do because the business driver said we had to do it for some unknown reason, whether it's rely on some really bad auth protocol or have some bad scheme just because of some sort of integration related ops. These are things that often expose companies and organizations as well. And I know it's a small part of this slide, but I think really as we look at identity professionals becoming more and more security professionals, this is something that's really going to impact us going on in latter years.
Yeah, so what's at the root of all this stuff? Targeted all big breaches is identity. And when we say identity, right, we're talking about really the underlying authentication and authorization protocols that all identity-based applications rely on, right? And that's why we call it kind of the apex control, right? If you look at, and we'll go into what Kerberos is and all these other different things, but if you look at things like, SSO, if you look at PAM, right, all these these identity-centric applications, at one point or another, whether Active Directory is on-prem, whether it's hybrid, whether it's in the cloud, they're talking back to the single source of truth, right? And that single source of truth is Active Directory in many, many cases. I mean, there are some nuances in some businesses, right? But for the most part, in the majority of businesses, the single source of truth for identity and privilege is Active Directory, right? And these identity-focused solutions that make single sign-on easier, that focus on privileged access management, they're all getting their information from Active Directory. So if you are unable to mitigate the risks associated with the authentication authorization protocols in Active Directory, you're at greater risk for these applications not doing what they're supposed to do downstream, right? Because again, they're all relying on Active Directory, and Active Directory giving them information, so doing what they say they can do.
One thing I kind of want to add here, just as a show's hand, who's familiar with tools like EDR, XDR, those types of platforms? Okay, excellent. So when you look at kind of the context of those tools here, we're not here to say, if your Active Directory is perfect, you never need an XDR, EDR, AV again. That's not the premise at all. This is part of a defense in-depth strategy that every organization should have. But when you look at the context of how these tools are actually guarding your organization, it's very much on the perimeter basis, so the endpoint. I want to prevent malware from launching or initiating in my environments, but even in those tools, they often fail. Look at CrowdStrike. Now, George Kurtz, CEO of CrowdStrike, has said in congressional reports that you have to assume breach. CrowdStrike, rightfully so, is a Gartner Quadrant leading solution, but even they say you need to investigate things that are going on consistently. But we often see in cases of APT29, lapsus, identities they follow one step from any initial breach, whether it's via ransomware or malware delivery, or even simply something as simple as I stole credentials, or I even purchased credentials. People are selling authentication tokens and cookies readily on the internet or buying them from either disgruntled or crimes of opportunity from employee bases as an insider threat vector. But those are things just to kind of frame the talk here and kind of where we're going with this is in terms of direction.
Yeah, we kind of touched on it a little bit. It's a nice little meme there with that dumpster fire. I love that. But enterprise authentication, as Brian mentioned, right? We kind of view this as arguably any organization's largest security risk. And again, enterprise authentication being the authentication protocols natively used by Active Directory, given the nature that all of your downstream applications rely on it, right? And the issue that we see is really not much has changed since, if you look at Maersk in 2016, and you fast forward 3-4 years, you look at what happened with SolarWinds and all these other ones that everybody's familiar with. Again, the common theme is abuse of SAML, abuse of Kerberos, right? Abuse of DRS, abuse of all these protocols used by Active Directory to validate that Rob is who he claims to be, right? And therefore has access to the application that he should have access for based on his privileges. So, it's both your largest, again, in our view, largest IT risk and largest IT asset from that perspective. Brian, anything you would add to that?
Yeah,
right,
of course.
Yeah.
Well, that's why I brought this slide.
Okay.
So what I like about this here is it really helps contextualize what people might be doing today already. Now, we label complex on here, but this is not to say any logo you see in this slide is meant to say you don't need this or it's bad or anything like that. Not meant to be here. What it is meant is we like to use the kill chain here to kind of highlight concentration of controls, concentration of protection people make investments in readily available today. You look at your firewall vendors, you look at EDR vendors, you look at AV vendors, you look at DLP vendors. They're all focused on endpoint, on initial breach, initial compromise, which is important to any security program, but it does leave you fairly gapped on what happens afterwards. How to identify once people gain access, which is common. We know it as every vendor you've spoken to or everyone you see is always going to tell you ransomware is going to get worse in the next 10 years by some level of $1 trillion, right? You've all heard that probably 10 times this week. Exactly. So our premise is we want to be able to do two things. As identity professionals, really focus on a preventative side of how we can improve organizations today. Then also, how do I respond when those attacks actually occur in the organizations? So the first side is how do I look and identify risks or in my implementation of AD? This is a common thing a lot of people are already doing. You look at tools, open source such as Bloodhound, or there's a lot of different vendors that are displaying here this week that focus on those types of things. But there's also the side here that a lot of people are exploring and looking into expanding into is attack detection. How do I know when these types of things or these types of violations are occurring in networks, in my environment, and be able to respond to them in a reliable fashion?
Yeah, I think the reason why the ability to reduce the dwell time associated with a lot of these techniques that target Active Directory as a point of compromise is, right, if we could prevent everything, that would be great. And it is best practice, right, to monitor a lot of your primary risk vectors associated with Active Directory. So things like stale accounts or over-privileged accounts that are a few hops away from a domain controller, for example. So yes, we need to look at these things. But oftentimes, especially in larger organizations, Active Directory has been around for 20, 25 years, and it is ingrained in a lot of the core business processes. So if you go to the business and say, hey, I want to change this policy in Active Directory, I want to change this workflow, or I want to do this or that, they're going to say, get lost, right? This is something that we've been doing for 20 years. It is foundational to our processes, our internal business processes, and maybe sometimes even customer-facing business processes. You're not going to change anything. And you just have to accept that risk as a practitioner, right? So that's why the detection piece is also critical, right? Because you have to assume that something is going to happen and be prepared for when it does. And this is where you kind of cross over from the sysadmin identity type professional to the behind the desk security practitioner, right? The tried and true analyst that's focused on investigate, triage, remediate, et cetera. So it's important that those two functional areas work cohesively in kind of a preventative and detection mindset.
The only other point I want to add on here is when you look at these threats, these campaigns against organizations globally, once identity is compromised, whether it's a follow-on activity from ransomware or malware, or if it's part of the initial breach, Lapsus is very prominent for this, where they annoy people by abusing MFA into accepting prompts to gain access to organizations. Once you have an identity component in an attack, a lot of these tools really can't do much for you. Encryption will decrypt, DLP will have access to files, AV, EDR really aren't monitoring for it. UEBA can do some stuff, but we also, UEBA requires a drastic change for you to actually detect it. And so being able to monitor things at an accurate way is very difficult across the board of a problem for organizations. So how do we see it? So I like this slide a lot. One, because it's always a shock when there's another Microsoft issue going on related to identity or Azure or AD or Exchange constantly happening. But then we also look at Microsoft security reference architecture. I've been doing this for a couple of years, and I'm still regularly lost in this document. But looking at understanding where am I monitoring from, do I have my log level set right, am I centralizing this in core places? And Microsoft has certainly made good strides in making this easier. They have expanded managed services components. Their Sentinel solution has made leaps and bounds. The Defender platform from AV and EDR has grown immensely over the past couple of years. But it's still very, very complicated for medium-sized businesses, what I call irregular enterprises, and to handle these types of things. And it makes it very, very complicated for organizations to function securely as part of it. And Microsoft, by its nature, is fundamental for a lot of organizations to work with or to be a part of. Now, we've been mentioning protocol a lot, and this is, I'm really fortunate, I'm glad that we have an audience like you guys who I feel like has a good understanding of what this is today. The component of looking at the exchange of handshakes between a KDC, a privileged user, and someone they're trying to access a resource. But this is what we're talking about when we talk about authentication. When it comes down to the core protocol of what every enterprise is functioning on, it is Kerberos. And what attackers are doing is they're exposing and they're taking advantage of this handshake because it relies on an assumption of session keys. And by taking advantage of and pulling and extracting keys out of memory, they're able to forge tickets and identities, grant themselves access to privilege and rights they wouldn't normally have access to, and aren't easily detectable because there simply isn't logging really at a Windows level for identifying this. It's just not there. And this is why there's so prevalent attack vectors in a majority of ransomware campaigns. We're seeing this in around 85% of attacks across the world. There's an identity component that does involve abuse of this or DRS for persistence or things around that nature. Rob, anything here?
Yeah, I mean, I would just say, but if you're familiar with Kerberos, right, by nature, it's a stateless protocol. So Brian mentioned, right, there's no native way to really monitor this, which makes it such an attractive vector for for adversaries. What I'll say is that abuse of the Kerberos authentication protocol used to be low probability, high impact, right? And you still have to have highly privileged access in order to start forging your own authentication ticket off of a domain controller. But a lot of these scripts out there are making it far easier to do this in 10, 15 minutes, 20 minutes, even less sometimes, right? And you can modify the Mimikatz code base ever so slightly, or Rubius or Kakao, or pick whatever attacker tool you like to bypass some of those signature-based detections. And now, right, you're on a domain controller and you're able to escalate privilege and start literally forging your own identity in Active Directory, which makes it very, very difficult. If you're blended, you look normal, right? You look completely normal to the network, and at that point, domain dominance, you literally do whatever you want, right? And so, thanks for switching that. That's actually a good segue, right? So, why should I care, right? And I like to equate this to, right, and when we were all in college, I don't know, maybe some of you had fake IDs, maybe I, of course, didn't.
I did. I absolutely did.
But, right, you present your ID to the bouncer at your local bar or pub or what have you, and if it looks good, you're going to get through, right? The bouncer has no idea where the ID came. Did it come from the DMV? Did it come from, right, some other state regulated agency? There's no trace of where or how the ID was generated, right?
There's also a great example too, if you look at airplane tickets as a scenario. You buy an airplane ticket, you get it printed off at the kiosk, you go through security, TSA checks it, scans, good through. You go to the gate, scans, checks, good through. But you can legitimately walk down the gangway, take a Sharpie, write the word pilot on it, and then walk on the airplane and say, hey, by the way, guys, I'm pilot today. I'm not sitting in seat 31D, which I probably have on the way home, but I'm actually the pilot today. That's how attackers are abusing this protocol and gaining that access, forging legitimate tickets, but creating the rights that they want as part of the attack. And that's also what college kids do. I have a fake ID that says 21 instead of 19. I want to be able to drink. And attackers do this repeatedly. And this is why we focus on the Kerb protocol as our foundation of truth, but also how we validate everything that we do in organizations.
Right. And when we say, where the ticket's coming from, so we want to make sure that, like in the scenario of a golden ticket attack, for example, if anybody's familiar with the golden ticket attack, in that instance, once the adversary is able to land on a domain controller, they're able to start forging their own authentication tickets, right? Or even maybe it's prefaced by a DC sync or DC shadow attack, where they're impersonating a domain controller and then forging their own tickets, right? Being able to identify that this ticket, this Kerberos authentication ticket, was duly issued by a domain controller and not forged from an illicit source is critical to establishing that foundation of truth organizationally, right? Not just being able to detect attacks, but again, since all of your downstream applications assume that everybody is who they claim to be at the Active Directory level, right? If they're not, you then can't trust anything downstream. So that's why it's so critical to be able to validate that the Kerberos protocol, or maybe in the instance of cloud or third-party applications, the SAML protocol, is working the way it's supposed to work, in sequence, in conjunction, right? Otherwise, you're opening yourself up to anybody or any service, any identity or any service on your network being illicit without you knowing. Yep, so I mean, this just, again, kind of hit on what Brian was talking about earlier. The way, just kind of the whole idea of assuming breach, right? Assuming that the perimeter will be breached. And the reason why it's very difficult, and when we talk about these techniques that abuse Kerberos and abuse other AD authentication protocols, the reason why it's very difficult to identify them is because they persist for a very long time before they actually do anything, right? They may persist for months or even in some instances, a year plus, and they're gonna behave normally, right? They're gonna blend into those normal network patterns, the normal network behavior, right? And then once you're comfortable, that's when it's gonna happen, right? And that's what we constantly see all the time. So
these are all common evasion techniques too, right?
What's that?
I said sleep timers, not doing anything, low and slow approaches are all common evasion techniques. People, once they have footholds, they don't want to set off alarms. They want to milk you for all you're worth. Your customers, anything they can get out of you. And if a low and slow approach works really, really well, they're going to do so. So you can't join activity, you can't monitor, from the SOC type perspective, which is why identity is so attractive. Because once you have an established identity foothold, detection becomes more and more difficult. You're not looking at multiple failed logins. You're not looking at alerts are triggered from malware because you're now a user in the environment or you're an SPN in the environment. So this is why it's such a big target or a goal for them to hit for really kind of milking organizations for money.
Yeah, and to kind of bring this full circle to what I was talking about at the top of this presentation with compliance, highly doubt that NIST, ISO, or name your compliance framework has a control box to check for Kerberos protocol monitoring, right? And this is why it's important. And it's not, we're not suggesting that all your problems are going to go away if you're able to monitor Kerberos effectively, because that is far from the truth, right? It's a constant battle in security. It always is. But what we are saying is that, right, these are things that it takes some convincing to the business, right, to the business stakeholders of why these things are important and why you have to do them. But it goes beyond just checking the box, right, and being able to tell your cyber liability insurance company, like, hey, we're NIST compliant, so drop our premiums, right, something like that. And even in that case, right, downtime is oftentimes worse than having to pay out, right?
So we spent maybe, 30 minutes talking about a problem and all the issues and the impact on why it's the worst thing in the world, right? We have to impress upon those things. But I want to make sure we're able to leave you with ideas on things you can do to help remediate, fix, address, or at least even be able to look or even scope out the problem that you might have. Being able to look at things from the outside in. Like, there's a lot of vendors out there that look at attack surface monitoring. ASM, or attack surface monitoring, has been listed by Gartner as one of the top 3 emerging trends in cybersecurity for 2022. We also agree with that, part of that. You look at how attractive is my organization from a public perspective, because that's often going to lead to internal attacks. But then we also look at it from an inside approach too. And you have a lot of great tools that are out there, both free and also paid, that you can leverage to kind of identify risk inside your organizations, looking at tooling such as the suite from SpectreOps, the Bloodhound tooling, the SharpHound tooling. QOMPLX, of course, has their own tooling available for this as well as part of that. But looking to understand enumerating groups, identifying issues of inherency, where people may have nested and gained rights and privileges where they shouldn't have. You look at the ever-changing best practices, or also the ever-changing rotation of admins inside your environment. It happens naturally, not necessarily malicious in behavior, but it is exposure. And also attackers do look for finding these, we'll call mess-ups, but natural things that occur via human nature, and then try to exploit them further. And so we want to be able to quantify, label, identify, so you guys can take the legitimate steps over time to improve that posture.
Literally the first thing you can do, right? What does my Active Directory environment look like? Literally. And like Brian said, open source tools to do it. But in doing this, you're giving yourself a treasure map, essentially, of what an attacker is most likely to exploit in Active Directory before they exploit it. This allows you to be proactive and preemptive in identifying, maybe trust that you didn't know about, or that legacy trusts, right? Overprivileged accounts, stale accounts. Maybe there are accounts that are not adherent with password policy. This happens everywhere. And don't feel like if these exist in your organization, you're doing something wrong. It's literally just the result of a business evolving and growing over time. It's just what happens, right? People come, people go, processes come, processes go. And so you have to keep tabs on what this looks like, because that's what adversaries are banking on, right? They're banking on us being disorganized and having a less than ideal grasp of what our AD environment looks like, because that allows them to, then it becomes easier for them to exploit it. So be preemptive, look at these things and take those preemptive measures to close off those attack pathways. You want to?
Oh yeah, I can go.
Yeah.
Yeah. So there's other things too, right? This is a lot of kind of the points I made on the last slide, and this is just slide version. So if you want to take your pictures, absolutely more than welcome to. But being able to look and again monitor for the nested groups, the inherency risks. AD's been a technology that's old enough to drink at this point with a legitimate ID, not a fake one. And things just happen. There's also parts where we're going to recommend around prevention is simply not enough for most organizations. Prevention falls in very much of what people are currently doing today. Looking at the endpoint or the perimeter boundary, whether the perimeter is network, if the perimeter is your hosted machine, so desktop, laptops, workstations. But now we're also saying identity is also a perimeter that you also need to start managing proactively as well. Identity is a firewall in most cases. This is something that Rob and I like to say when we talk to organizations, talk to groups. But being able to actively identify and validate that authentication flows, people logging into the environment are not being manipulated against, is really very important as part of any security program, should be adopted by a lot of components. You look at organizations like Wavestone and Gartner are calling out things like ITDR, identity threat detection and response, as necessary emerging trends for organizations to take a look at as part of 2022 and beyond, because we're seeing a concentration of attacks focusing on identity layer. And by being able to validate identity, detect against it, and respond to identity-related attacks, it makes your organizations more and more secure.
Yeah, and the other thing too, right, is something as simple as like enabling well-based monitoring, just looking at Windows event logs, and having some kind of monitoring system in place, and then having that incident response process in place. And again, I think I mentioned it before, but the communication between the folks who own Active Directory and the security team is also critical, right? Because that's going to be that kind of that prevention and detection really go hand in hand, and the left arm has to know what the right one is doing in order to be effective.
I'm a firm believer that identity teams should be part of the security group in most organizations. It's a key component. Your voices are important to the conversation and absolutely should be considered as part of security plans.
Yeah.
I think that's really it, right? So we have some content and resources. I think these slides are being made public, so you'll have access to the links and the URLs to kind of look at some of the resources that we have. We kind of speak to, and a lot of our content is kind of based off of, so if you want to do that deeper research, you're absolutely more than welcome to. We want to be very informative and knowledge forward with that. But I think right now really it's just questions. We're happy to kind of take anything from the audience, things all. If you want to speak to Man-Bun 1 or Man-Bun 2 specifically, just say so. We're happy to address it.
Do we really cover everything? Were we that good? I mean,
it's the power of the Man-Bun, Rob.
Yeah, okay.
Well, that's really kind of it on our side. QOMPLX is in the hall in Startup Alley, generally close to the bar, the cookies.
Oh yeah.
So one question that, okay, all these being proactive, like monitoring, all this stuff is good. But what if this ransomware, somebody succeeds, they get control of your AD? What options do you have then?
So that's the assumption that we're relying on, right? We know ransomware campaigns are going to break that initial vector. You pick any EDR AV vendor, pick their name, add the word bypass to it, and you'll see 60,000 plus hits on how to bypass that control. Once someone gains that initial vector access, they are going to generally land on a user workstation laptop identity component. Now, I know my company will never pay for my identity or my laptop to be unlocked, ever. Rob's too, right? Generally, individual users don't own data that's really valuable to an attacker or to a company. They'll tell you, here, reimage your machine and you're good to go. It's that pivot and that escalation into privilege account. Exactly. And this is where QOMPLX focuses our detections, focuses where our belief of where that fundamental control should be is monitoring that lateral movement capability, monitoring that capability to move into Active Directory. We want to control that component as well, so prevent those things from occurring. Because once you own AD, organizations are effectively hosts. You own, a high-level account. You're creating permissions, rights. You're encrypting everything. All the bad scenarios. I'm sure people have repeated to you 100 times already this week. But that's where we are focusing that component, that escalation, that lateral movement, the establishing persistence at DRS. Attackers would look into creating domain controllers rogue, and then replicating their own user accounts, their own identities, inserting themselves into the right groups they want to be in. You look, AD admins is a common one, but there's a lot of other valuable groups that commonly aren't monitored. Replicators, DNS admins, things like that people also focus on as a way to be slow, but then also fall outside the bounds of normal observability, which would be standard well logging or your AV or EDR platforms.
Yeah, and that's a great question, right? But I think even on a higher level, before we can even talk about like what happens, what's the best way to isolate and contain the threat if somebody gets a hold and a foothold in Active Directory? It's helping businesses realize the importance of protecting Active Directory in general, and getting businesses to realize on a fundamental level that if you're an attacker, let's say phishing attack, whatever it is, you get past the perimeter, there's nothing of value you can really do unless you are able to compromise Active Directory. And this is something that is very commonly overlooked because it's just assumed that it's like, why would I have to secure security, right? I mean, Active Directory is supposed to be natively secure. So in the eyes of corporate decision makers, people with the purse, we, I think, as practitioners, right, as an industry, have to help business stakeholders understand that there's a place for this, right, as a critical functional area of the operational part of the business.
My company hires an outsourced vendor to purposely
Yeah, no, that's great.
Are they successful regularly? Well, thank you for the validation.
Yeah.
I appreciate you.
Maybe you should be up here, yeah.
All right, anything else, guys? All right, well, thank you, everyone. Appreciate you guys coming and checking us out.
Thank you, appreciate it.
Again, QOMPLX Startup Alley, right across from a bar or cookies or candy. You'll find us there. And you'll see Molly at our booth here. Molly, just wave. She'll answer all your questions.